The Case of the Laughing Man. The year was 1887. London, the heart of the British Empire, pulsed with the pride of progress and power. Steam engines roared through coal-stained streets. Factories churned day and night, and gaslights flickered like ghostly eyes in alleyways. But beneath the surface of this seemingly indomitable city beat the heart of a darker truth. London was afraid. The East End, in particular, bore the weight of this fear. Thick fog rolled in from the Thames like a slow, moving spectre, swallowing streets whole. It muffled footsteps, cloaked alleyways, and distorted the sound of the city into something eerie, something unnatural. People called it the London Particular. But in 1887 it was more than just fog. It was cover, it was silence, and it was hiding something. The city had seen crime before. It had endured thieves, pickpockets, and even murderers. But this was different. What began as whispers in Whitechapel taverns turned into full-blown rumors that stretched all the way to Westminster. Someone was stalking the fog, and they weren't stealing bread or coins. They were taking lives and leaving behind smiles, bloody, horrific, carved smiles on the faces of their victims. He was first called the Laughing Man by a chimney-sweep boy who swore he heard laughter echoing through the alley where an apothecary's body was later found, face mutilated into a permanent grin. The boy said the laughter didn't sound joyful. It was empty, like a hollow puppet mimicking the sound of a human, and then it was gone, swallowed by the fog. The newspapers fed on the fear like starving wolves. Monster in the mist, screamed one headline. The smiling killer strikes again, warned another. The public, already gripped by uncertainty due to poverty, disease, and rising unrest, now had a singular enemy they couldn't see, one they couldn't predict. But fear didn't just rise from the crimes. It festered in the silence of the authorities. Scotland Yard had no suspects, no motive, no answers. There was no pattern to the victims. One was doctor, another a street performer, one was a woman who taught Sunday school, another a retired butcher. All had one thing in common, that cursed, grotesque smile cut into their flesh. Parents kept their children inside, men traveled in groups, women no longer walked alone, even in daylight. Police patrols doubled, church bells rang longer, and the fog, oh, that relentless fog, kept rolling in, night after night, as if protecting the Laughing Man himself. In the cafes of Bloomsbury, writers and poets speculated that the killer was a reflection of the age itself, a twisted symbol of a society that had become cold, industrial, and inhumane. "We've built machines," one journalist wrote, "but forgotten the heart." The killer in the fog reminds us, something inside us is broken. But even among the terror, something else began to stir, a sense of wakefulness. For too long, the city had ignored its poor, its orphaned, its abused. The East End had been a dumping ground for the forgotten. Now suddenly people cared, not because of compassion, but because of fear. And sometimes, fear wakes people up to what love had long failed to do. A young detective by the name of Thomas Bray, just 32 years old, saw through the hysteria. He believed the killer was not a ghost or demon, but a man made by this very city. You don't carve a smile into someone's face unless you've been forced to wear one you didn't earn. He famously said in his private notebook, Bray didn't just walk the cobbled streets, he studied them. He didn't just chase shadows, he questioned the light, and as he followed the case deeper, he began to suspect that this wasn't just murder. This was a message from someone who had been silenced for too long. By the end of 1887, 6 people were dead. The city's trust had crumbled. The fog had become a metaphor for everything London wished to forget: its cruelty, its inequality, its hunger, its neglect, and hidden inside it was a man whose laughter haunted a nation. But the story and the truth behind the Laughing Man was only just beginning. When the first victim turned up in late January of 1887, the city labeled it a tragedy. A 53-year-old apothecary named Mr. Alastair Fenwick, respected and mild-mannered, was found slumped behind his shop counter in East End London. His throat had been cleanly slit, but it was his face that horrified investigators. Someone had carved a deep, crescent-shaped gash from cheek to cheek, forming a grotesque bleeding smile. There were no signs of robbery, no broken locks, no screams heard. A freak murder, they said. 2 weeks later, a young actress named Molly Garrett, aged 24, was discovered in an alley behind the dilapidated Queen's Theatre. Her face bore the same mutilation. This time, though, Coroner noticed something chilling. The smile wasn't random. It was deliberate, even surgical. The city started to whisper. The newspapers coined the term "the laughing man." Panic began to stir, but the officials at Scotland Yard assured the public that these crimes were isolated, unrelated events, but Detective Thomas Bray didn't agree. By the time the fourth body appeared, a priest, Father William Maddox, found slumped over the altar of a tiny parish chapel. Bray had noticed something no one else seemed willing to see. The victims had a pattern, but it wasn't what you'd expect from a serial killer. They weren't all women or prostitutes or linked by age, location, or time of death. Instead, they were linked by something far more subtle, far more sinister, a trail of past cruelty. Bray began to dig. Mr. Fenwick, the apothecary, records revealed multiple complaints of refusing medical aid to the poor. A homeless mother had died on his doorstep after he refused her a bottle of laudanum. He was never charged. Molly Garrett, before her brief career on stage, she had worked at the Whitestone Orphanage as a caretaker. One former orphan, now in prison, testified that she had regularly mocked and beaten children, especially those with physical deformities. Father Maddox, respected by society, yes, but Bray found an unsigned letter in the church's confessional box that claimed the priest had used divine punishment as an excuse for beatings in the orphanage. Sunday school. It was as if a pattern had been carefully buried beneath a facade of reputation. Each victim had worn a mask of respectability, but behind it, they had inflicted suffering on society's forgotten. The killer didn't strike at random. He was selecting people who had once held power and had abused it. This theory, however, was dangerous. It suggested something no one in London's upper echelons wanted to hear, that the killer wasn't choosing victims based on evil but on justice. Newspapers refused to print Bray's findings. The church called it blasphemy. Scotland Yard warned him to stop pursuing a narrative that would glorify a murderer. But Bray persisted, because something about the precision of the crimes, the silence surrounding them, and the message carved into every smiling face said one thing: this killer was telling a story. Bray began looking into orphanages, poorhouses, and workhouses. He interviewed adults who had grown up in these institutions, and the pattern became clearer. Every victim had some tie, direct or indirect, to a network of abusive authority that operated under society's blind eye. The laughing man, whoever he was, wasn't just murdering people. He was sending a message to those who wear masks of power. But why the smile? One former orphan, now a clockmaker's apprentice, told Bray, when they beat us, they'd say, "Smile, boy, or you'll get worse." They'd say, "Grin and bear it." The smile was part of the punishment. That's when it clicked for Bray. The smile was symbolic, a twisted revenge against those who had once forced their victims to hide their pain behind a smile. It wasn't madness, it was memory. Yet the truth disturbed more than it healed, because to admit this pattern meant admitting that these victims weren't purely innocent, that society in some way had created the monster it now feared. And still, the city denied it. Better to believe in a madman hiding in the fog than to confront the cruelty buried in the city's own past. But Bray knew the truth. He saw it in every etched grin. The killer wasn't choosing victims randomly. He was choosing them purposefully, and that meant he wasn't finished. The fog may have hidden the killer, but the truth was beginning to rise like a scream beneath a forced smile. By the spring of 1887, London was gripped by terror, and the laughing man had become more legend than flesh. Newspapers speculated wildly. Some claimed he was a deranged surgeon. Others believed he was a ghost, the tormented spirit of someone wrongly executed, returned to take vengeance on the living. The more grotesque the theory, the more the public clung to it. After all, it was easier to believe in a monster than to admit that such horror could be human. But Detective Thomas Bray wasn't interested in stories. He was interested in the truth. Bray's investigations had begun to unravel a disturbing pattern, not just in the victims, but in the psychology behind their selection. Each was connected to systems of cruelty, orphanages, poorhouses, hospitals that turned away the desperate. And so Bray began to look into those places, not just for victims, but for the one who remembered. His breakthrough came at Whitestone Orphanage, long since shut down after reports of abuse, neglect, and unmarked graves. Bray discovered a set of incomplete files. Most had been lost or destroyed, but one record stood out. A child named Walter Greaves, admitted in 1852 at the age of 7. Walter's file was stained with ink and time, but the facts were clear. His mother had died of illness. His father, a dock worker, was killed in an accident. Left with no family, Walter was sent to Whitestone. The note attached to his intake form simply read, "Quiet, obedient." Disfigured, further digging revealed why. At age 5, Walter had suffered a brutal accident. A drunk neighbor had thrown boiling water during a domestic dispute, and Walter, caught in the crossfire, had his lower face badly burned. Multiple crude surgeries had left his mouth twisted, not in a smile, but something close to it. A grim, unnatural expression that society read as mockery. Walter didn't speak much after that. He was often laughed at by other children. More disturbingly, he was punished for mocking authority. His expression misunderstood as defiance rather than injury. And yet Walter was brilliant. Bray uncovered notes from an old schoolmaster who had briefly taught at the orphanage. The boy reads medical texts, fascinated with anatomy, sketches with precision beyond his age. Might become a doctor if the world does not break him first. But the world did break him. At age 14, Walter was apprenticed to a butcher. He lasted less than a year. Rumors said he snapped after being mocked. He vanished shortly after and was presumed dead, swallowed by London's endless slums. But Bray no longer believed Walter had died. He believed Walter had evolved, shaped by cruelty, sharpened by pain, and trained by the very institutions that had failed him. As Bray traced the evidence further, he uncovered scattered sightings of a strange, silent man, one who fixed watches, carved puppets, and occasionally assisted in surgeries under a false name. No one knew where he came from, but each description shared one detail: a man with a stiff, unsettling grin. It was Walter, and suddenly the truth was no longer a ghost story. It was the tragic unraveling of a brilliant, gentle boy, a child who had dreamed of healing others, yet had been treated like a curse, rejected, laughed at, ignored. Bray saw it clearly now. The laughing man was never some supernatural phantom. He was the creation of a society that punishes difference, mocks the wounded, and abandons the vulnerable. But what haunted Bray most wasn't Walter's crimes. It was how many chances the world had to save him and didn't. What if someone had treated his scars with dignity? What if his brilliance had been nurtured? What if someone had simply believed in him instead of branding him a freak? Walter Greaves wasn't born a killer. He was born kind. A quiet, intelligent child who had once drawn diagrams of human hearts and dreamed of becoming a surgeon. He had no family, no protector, and no voice. So eventually, he gave up trying to be heard and instead made others listen. Through fear, in a world that rewarded cruelty and masked it with power, Walter had become a twisted reflection not of madness, but of what happens when compassion is denied and silence is weaponized. Bray sat alone in his office, surrounded by sketches, testimonies, and newspaper clippings. He whispered to himself, he wasn't a ghost, he was a boy. And we turned him into a shadow. And outside, the fog rolled in again, not to hide a monster, but to remind London of the soul it had once forgotten. For months, Londoners believed the laughing man was something more than human, a phantom conjured from the shadows, born in the fog and cloaked in vengeance. The stories twisted into legend. Some called him a demon, others a spirit of the damned, sent to punish the wicked. Children whispered about him in the dark. Priests warned their flocks to stay righteous, lest the laughing man find them. But one man knew better, Detective Thomas Bray. Unlike most of his colleagues, didn't chase shadows, he chased motives. He believed no one was born evil. Behind every monstrous act, he argued, was a scar, a wound. And as he dug through the darkness that surrounded the murders, he found not a ghost but a boy who had once been gentle. The name was Walter Greaves, born in 1845 in the crumbling outskirts of Bethnal Green. Walter had a quietness to him even as a child. His mother, Mary Greaves, was a seamstress who died of consumption when Walter was just 5. His father, a dock worker with an ailing liver and a temper, left the Boy at Whitestone Orphanage soon after her funeral. That was the last time anyone from Walter's family was ever seen. Walter entered the orphanage with a kind heart and curious mind. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were soft, thoughtful. He loved books, especially ones about science, medicine, and the stars. One of the nuns, Sister Eliza, had written in a rarely read journal, "He is the quietest child in our care, but he listens, always listens. His mind is alive." But Walter had a disfigurement that set him apart. At age 4, he'd been caught in a kitchen accident that left the left side of his face badly burned. Later surgeries stretched his cheeks upward in an unnatural way, not enough to be grotesque, but enough to leave an unsettling impression, a permanent faint smile. That smile, misunderstood, ridiculed, and feared, became his curse. The other children mocked him relentlessly. Clown face, they called him, devil's grin. Some of the staff, rigid and cold, treated him as if his very appearance was a sin. Mark of bad blood, a sign of spiritual rot. When he cried, they accused him of mocking sorrow. When he laughed, and he rarely did, they scolded him for inviting darkness. Walter withdrew further, but his intelligence only grew. He began sketching from the books he read, detailed diagrams of the human body. In private, he built miniature machines from scrap metal. His dream, once spoken to a visiting doctor, was to become a surgeon, someone who could help fix broken bodies, someone who wouldn't look away from deformity but understand it. But London wasn't kind to poor boys with broken faces. By 13, he was sent to labor in a slaughterhouse, where he learned how to carve meat with the precision of a craftsman. His skill didn't go unnoticed, but neither did his silence. His foreman accused him of arrogance. Another man once mocked his grin and ended up with a broken nose. Walter disappeared not long after. For nearly 2 decades his name vanished from records, but in hidden corners of London he was spotted, assisting with surgeries under assumed names, offering to repair clocks, sketching anatomy in taverns by candlelight, always quiet, always alone. What turned him into the Laughing Man is something Bray could never definitively prove, but he pieced together the pieces. One of Walter's tormentors at the orphanage became a renowned apothecary, later found murdered. Another, a cruel deacon from Whitestone, became a priest and ended up with a smile carved into his face. Every victim had a role in burying the boy Walter had once been. The truth was undeniable. He wasn't a monster born of hell. He was a boy who had once dreamed of healing. A boy crushed under the weight of mockery, abuse, and rejection. The permanent smile carved into his own face had become the signature he left behind, not out of pride, but as a warning, a symbol of forced happiness, of hiding pain, of wearing a smile because the world never lets you cry. Walter Greaves, the so-called Laughing Man, wasn't supernatural. He was painfully human, and that made him more terrifying than any ghost, because what he became was not the work of magic or madness. It was the work of neglect, of cruelty, of a society that saw a child suffering and turned away. And that is what haunted Detective Bray most. Not the crimes, not the fog, but the fact that none of it had happen. If only someone had seen the gentle soul behind the scarred smile. By the fall of 1887, London had become a city on edge. The fog felt heavier, the streets quieter. 6 people had died in chillingly similar fashion, their mouths carved into grotesque grins, and yet the killer left behind no fingerprints, no witnesses, no errors. He was a ghost in the mist, but Detective Thomas Bray knew better. Ghosts don't bleed, and ghosts don't remember pain. Bray had spent months mapping the shadows, interviewing street children, orphanage survivors, and forgotten workers from butcher shops and old hospitals. He was chasing not just a name, but a soul, the scarred, brilliant boy named Walter Greaves, whose face had once been mutilated into a grin, and whose heart had been slowly turned into stone by cruelty, rejection, and silence. Bray's instincts told him Walter was still in London, hiding in plain sight, not as a beast, but as a man who still carried the gentleness of his youth, buried beneath decades of trauma. He wasn't killing at random, he was following a dark logic, a story, a message, and so Bray did something no one else had dared. He stopped looking for a criminal, he started looking for a home. Old records had suggested Walter had taken a deep interest in puppetry and clockwork. These weren't just hobbies, they were echoes of the control he never had. If he couldn't fix his face or his past, he could master time, motion, silence. Bray followed this pattern, tracing old puppet workshops and abandoned theaters. One address kept reappearing in the margins, the Holloway Theater, long shut down after a fire years prior. No one had been inside in over a decade. One fog-heavy evening, Bray approached it alone. The theater was cold and lifeless. Boards creaked beneath his boots. Dust swirled in shafts of moonlight. On stage sat broken marionettes, their painted faces peeling, some smiling, some weeping. But in the orchestra pit below, Bray saw a flicker of candlelight. He descended the side steps slowly, his revolver drawn but lowered. He wasn't there to kill, he was there to listen, and there he was, Walter Greaves, seated at a long wooden table cluttered with tools, sketches, and small mechanical limbs. His back was straight, his hands worked carefully, threading wire through the fingers of a puppet's hand, his face half-lit but candlelight bore that same haunting grin, only now Bray could see it for what it truly was, a scar, a memory, not a threat. Walter didn't look up. "I knew you'd come," he said softly. Bray said nothing for a moment. "Then you could have been so much more." Walter chuckled, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "I was, once, but the world didn't want that version." "What do you want from all this?" Bray asked. "Revenge." "No," Walter whispered. "Recognition." He finally looked up. His eyes weren't wild or enraged. They were exhausted, deeply human. "They smiled while they broke me," he said, "so I gave their smiles back." Bray lowered his revolver. He saw not a madman, but a message. A man who had been failed by society, by the system, by every adult who turned their back when he needed to be protected, mentored, healed. "You didn't have to become this," Bray said. "No," Walter replied, "but no one stopped me." There was no struggle that night, no chase, no violence. Walter stood, placed the puppet gently on the table, and held out his hands. "Will they kill me?" he asked. Bray shook his head. "Not if I can help it." Rather than throwing Walter into a dark cell to rot, Bray made a bold decision. He argued before the courts that Walter was not insane but damaged, that he wasn't evil but abandoned, and though the courts were reluctant, they agreed to commit Walter not to prison but to Blackthorn Asylum, a newly reformed mental institution focused on rehabilitation, not punishment. There, Walter became something unexpected, a teacher. He worked quietly with troubled youths. He showed them how to build small mechanical toys. He taught them anatomy. He listened to them in ways no adult had ever listened to him. He never asked for forgiveness. He never spoke of the murders, but he made sure no one else like him would walk alone into the dark. Detective Bray would later write in his memoir, "I did not spare a monster. I saved a man, and in saving him I may have saved many more." Years after the fog cleared and the murders stopped, the name "The Laughing Man" still echoed through London streets, but it was no longer spoken with fear. It was spoken with discomfort, with regret, with caution, because now everyone knew the truth. The man behind the carved smiles wasn't a demon or ghost, he was one of their own. Walter Greaves, once a gentle boy with a twisted face and a brilliant mind, had become a symbol far greater than the crimes he committed. He had grown up in the cracks of the empire, lost in orphanages, beaten by caretakers, mocked for the smile he never asked for. A child that could have changed the world was instead broken by it, and in that truth lay a warning. Walter's crimes were horrific. No one denied that. The mutilations, the silence, the fear. But what shook London to its core wasn't just the horror of his actions, it was the realization that he didn't emerge from the shadows. He was shaped by the city itself. The newspapers, once obsessed with tales of a phantom killer, gradually shifted their tone. Editorials began to ask hard questions. How had Whitestone Orphanage been allowed to operate for so long with no oversight? Why had so many children left its walls damaged and discarded? Why had no one intervened when Walter first appeared in hospitals and butcher shops? Clearly homeless, clearly wounded, clearly brilliant. The elite, once silent, were forced to reckon with truth. London had built the Laughing Man. Detective Thomas Bray, now older and a respected figure in Scotland Yard, published a controversial paper years later titled "The Child in the Monster." In it he wrote, "The question is not how could he do such terrible things. The question is, why didn't we stop him from ever needing to?" It sparked debate across the country. Laws were changed. Orphanages and workhouses were inspected more rigorously. A new wave of social reformers began pushing for mental health support for abused and abandoned children. And though slow, the seeds of change were planted in the shadow of Walter Greaves' story, but his legacy, painful as it was, went beyond policy. It lived in the hearts of those who realized that monsters are rarely born. They are forged by neglect, cruelty, and silence. At Blackthorn Asylum, where Walter spent his final years, his presence was quiet but profound. He never spoke of the killings, he never asked for pity, but he devoted himself fully to working with damaged youth children who reminded him of himself, the forgotten, the feared, the misjudged. He taught them how to build, how to sketch, how to understand the body, not to harm, but to heal. Some of his students went on to become nurses, mechanics, and teachers. Many of them said Walter never smiled, but he always listened. He always encouraged them to speak something no one had ever done for him. On the day of his death in 1902, from a sudden illness, the asylum staff found a single puppet left on his bedside table. It had a face not unlike his own, a stitched, crooked smile, but in its wooden hands was a scroll that read, "Don't carve your pain into others. Tell your story before it tells itself." That line would be quoted for decades. It appeared in psychology textbooks, criminal justice lectures, and later, on a plaque installed outside the ruins of the Whitestone orphanage now demolished. Walter Greaves had done terrible things, but in the strange way that only tragedy can teach, his life became a mirror showing a proud empire the cruelty it refused to see. His story taught that no child is beyond saving, but also that every child ignored is a danger waiting to be born. Even Detective Bray, a man grounded in law and logic, would often say to cadets in training, if you ever find yourself staring into the eyes of someone capable of horror, ask first, what did the world take from them before they took anything at all? The Laughing Man didn't become a legend because he was clever or violent or mysterious. He became a legend because he left behind something far more powerful than fear, a lesson. That lesson was this: pain that is silenced will one day speak, and when it does, it won't ask for permission. It will demand to be heard. So listen now to the quiet child, to the broken man, to the twisted grin hiding a lifetime of hurt, not to excuse what he did, but to make sure no one else ever has to become him. This is not just a tale of horror, it's a mirror to society. A child rejected can't become a monster if love and purpose are stripped away. But the same child, when seen and heard, can become a force of change. Everyone has a story. Before you judge their actions, ask where their pain began.